as I was unpacking with you some of the things that were going on in my life, you had shared something with me that blew my mind.
Mm.
And I'm going to paraphrase, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you had basically said, well, the good news is no matter what you would have done or tried to this point, you were going to find yourself right back here anyway.
Yep.
Like walk me through that a little bit, like, I guess kind of the how and why.
Sure. Well, so it was Carl Jung who I believe was the first person to talk about life in terms of two halves, where the first half is all about self-actualization and individuation, making something of myself, propping myself up. And the primary focus is the pursuit of power, possession, prestige.
Yeah.
It's all ego driven. But of course, we come to so closely identify with our ego that we think, well, this is just who I am. When in reality, your personality is not who you are. It's who you've become in response to what has happened to you or what hasn't happened to you, because that plays a role too. Unmet needs, etc. Yeah. And in order for us to cross over from the first half of life to the second half of life, which is all about transformation and transcendence, where we're put on the path towards a higher purpose and a higher power that is bigger than us, we have to go through necessary suffering. And that necessary suffering typically takes three forms: death, disease, or divorce. Right? It kind of has to be this struggle that is bigger than us, that our current mental resources, our strong willpower, our acquired knowledge is not a match for. So all of the personal development work that one does on oneself, and if you're listening to this, my guess is that you've done some level of personal development work, like yourself. The real work begins when you find yourself in that space where you are fundamentally out of control, you are limited, you are constricted, you're confined. The truest word for that, I think, is suffering. The mystics refer to it as liminal space, which is a Latin word which means threshold. You're in between your old comfort zone and any possible new direction, your old conditioning and your true essence. And that seems to be really the only thing that can break us out of the facade, right? Yeah. This life that we've been living that is largely based on who we think we need to be and what we should do. But it's not really a reflection of our authenticity. And if you believe in this, the Japanese call it your ikigai, your reason for being, your dhamma, right? Your purpose, right? And so that's what the second half of life is all about, is realizing your authenticity, but the God-given plan that he has for your life.
Yeah.
Right. And everyone believes in God, even if that, God is you. Yeah. So, right. But the reason being that you're here for a reason, right? You have a purpose. And if you don't, my guess is that you're not very happy.
Yeah.
Because, in the words of Leo Tolstoy, without knowing who I am and why I'm here, life is impossible. And so, playing the money game, and I say that because most men, that's kind of the game they're playing, right? Yep. The game of success, of, becoming better and self-actualizing, which is why I've said, I can't remember if I said it on our first podcast episode, but unconscious enslavement for so many men looks like constantly needing to be a better version of myself.
Yeah.
It's such a trap. Eventually it has to become about something other than you, right? Otherwise, it proves to be a very shallow game, and one that's not really worth playing. A perfect example for this is, when you become a parent, right? Becoming a parent changes your entire value system. Right now, it's not about what I want or what I value. It's about like, how is this decision, how is this direction going to impact that of my child? Mm-hmm. The problem is that most people continue to operate in what I would refer to as this egocentric level of psychological development. And so this is why we have children in adult bodies raising children.
Right. No, that's crazy, man. A lot of deep and good stuff there. And I think the team even joked with me after watching back our first podcast together as they were putting together some new clips. They're like, bro, we did not realize how many aha moments you had as Jake was talking. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, thank you. And the other joke was how many times I apparently drink coffee and sip water as I chat with folks on here. But yeah, to your point, like I didn't realize this until we had spent some time together. Everything that I was doing in my life was to build my own ego and my own kingdom. And so much so, you had mentioned God. And I remember when we first started Life by the Horns, there was this talk about faith, family, finance. And I consistently was like, no to the faith stuff. Sure. Like you do you. I'm not going to poo-poo any of that, but no to that. And then your first time you were here, you gave me a book as well.
Yeah.
And that book is all about, what you just spoke about. Yeah. Letting go of said ego, and again, paraphrasing, but then going on that journey of that second part of life. And I remember I also didn't open that book. And as I had reached back out to you in this lull that I was in, that I didn't know what to do. Yeah. I mean, I'm like I told you before this, I'm good at math and I'm good at spreadsheets. And that's where I was at in my life. I literally made a spreadsheet and said, what are the pros? What are the cons here? Sure. To help me make a decision. And I'm like, this is ludicrous. Like, not everything in life is this black and white. Yeah. And then I'd reached out to you, and it was late at night one night. And I'm like, I think you're right. The death, disease, or divorce. Like it is one of those things. And then you had responded back, and thank you for it. You had responded back and said, hey, you need to read or listen to this book. This is going to be your survival guide. Yep. And everybody else in my life, as much as I do love the close circle that I have, a lot of that superficial, help, right? And it's a lot of, if you need me, you call me, I'm here, whatever. Like there was, I had the support system, but I didn't have a guide. Yep. And it was just so, as good as I am at so many things, damn, like I was missing that. Yeah. And between those books and some of our talks, and we haven't even started deep work at this point, but they were so helpful for me to start seeing that, like, I'm not the God of my own life. And if I think that that's a burden I don't want to wear, I've been there. Yeah. Well, if you're getting advice from people who are still operating at the egocentric level of psychological development, they're going to see what you're going through as a problem that needs fixing. It is, and it's not at the same time, right? It's a paradox in that respect. You were always meant to end up here, because if you go down the road of personal development, of self-growth, of transformation, whatever you want to call it, you're always meant to end up at that point, at that place. Everything else before then was just a warm-up for that, right? It was bogus self-help on your own terms. Right. As Richard Rohr talks about in the book that I gave you. Yeah. Right. Very expensive self-help. 100%. Right. Yeah. And we kind of need to go through that. Yeah. Right. Because the ego, needs to be in control, but
the real work happens when we're not in control, right? And that's what the ego hates the most, because it wants to preserve the status quo. But it's only when we're not in control that true transformation is possible, right? That's what gets us to surrender, right? Which is why when you surrender the ego, right, your true self is going to be revealed, right? And that's where your gift is, your true gift, and you move beyond this. As my mentor once said, you're leaving behind the part of your personality that you've relied upon to get paid and get laid. And it's so true, right? Because the false self, also known as the ego, is just primarily concerned with being right and looking good, being separate and superior, which of course we're getting a lot of in this season, with the election. But in order to kind of have a life of happiness, which I don't, especially in the West, I don't think many people are concerned with that, which is why they find themselves building a life that they need to escape from. They find themselves in this pressure cooker, right? Well, every pressure cooker needs a pressure release valve, and that's where you bring in a coping mechanism. And obviously some coping mechanisms are more damaging than others, but in either respect, you're still addicted, which means, you're being controlled by the addiction and you're not in control of it.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that we suffer so much more in Western civilization, especially, and I know me being a guy, I'll speak for myself, but especially for men, it seems like there's this constant desire for more, better, new. All the time. We like the trophies. We like accolades. We like titles. We like money. We have a really hard time with feelings. And just sitting with ourselves.
Well, that's all first half of life stuff that you just described. And there's nothing wrong with it. To be clear, you need to play that game to realize that it's an empty one. Right. Because at a certain point in time, and we talked about this over lunch, where like these hyper successful people most of them are incredibly miserable. And this is going to fly right over the head of the ego. But I mean, honestly, this is why the message of Jesus is so powerful, and, find me a better influencer. The secret, quote unquote, is truly that we give it away to keep it. We suffer to get well. We die to live. That's the reality. Becoming the highest version of yourself is a death of many repetitions. People think that they go through, this deconstructive season where they experience hardship, they're out of control, and they're like, I've done it. I've experienced the big death. And, my answer to them is always maybe. We don't know. But regardless,
if anything, it sounds like that's just chapter 1.
For many, it is. Because of course, you know this, like the minute you get to the top of one mountain, what do you see off in the distance? The next one, right? The next one. And that just kind of seems to be this theme for life, that it's this constant dance of 4 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of thing. And the best thing that we can learn how to do is just surrender to it, dance to it. Otherwise, you're going to try to fight it, and you're just going to make things, more difficult on yourself. But going back to, the 2 halves of life, in the first half of life, it's all about building your tower. Thinking that what you really want is at the top, right? And so you should do that, right? You should build the business. You should, try to become rich and famous, and all those things. But then you're going to be called down from it, right? If you're actually serious about working on yourself. But that's a very difficult thing. And it's also a really beautiful thing simultaneously, because, when, you come down from your tower, and obviously in this moment, the tower is just a metaphor, for you becoming rich and famous, right? And self-actualizing and achieving that, you realize that there is nothing available to you at the top of your tower that isn't available to you at the bottom. Okay, what do I mean by this? Right before we clicked record, I was talking about how at one point in time, I wanted multiple houses in various parts of the country. And I thought, how cool would that be? And and they would be managed by, property management companies or whatever. Well, those managers need to be managed. Okay, well, now all of a sudden I find myself literally in a text conversation with my property manager in California, mere moments before we click record on this podcast. And he's asking me questions that I'm having to answer because there's an issue at my property in California. Right. Okay, well, what if I was able to afford to pay a manager that could then manage him? Right? My property manager in California. Well, now that costs me more money because I need to find a way to be able to afford and absorb the cost of that person. Yeah. Right. And it's a never ending game, right? Because what is that person going to inevitably end up doing? If there's a significant decision, correct. If there's a significant decision that needs to be made with regard to the property, that person's going to come back to me and they're going to say, hey, and this just happened 2 weeks ago. The hot tub needed to be replaced. Well, there's $10,000. Boop. Yep. Right. More money, more problems. And so when you realize that, the more you do this work, the more you crave a life of simplicity. And so you become content. This is going to sound so counterintuitive. But you can't listen with the ears of the ego, because the ears of the ego will absolutely reject this. It will simply go to what society, what culture, what the media, what celebrities value, which is all first half of life stuff. Mm-hmm. Power, possession, prestige, notoriety, right? Becoming rich and famous. Yeah. So if you listen to what I'm about to say with those ears, you're going to completely miss it. But truly, this is such a counterintuitive message, right? Which is what so much of Jesus's message was. And I don't care if you believe in God. I don't care if you believe that he was the Son of God. None of that matters, because we have what he said in recorded text. It is by far and away the most infallible document that exists. You can't find another one like it. And so if all you do is look at the Bible as a book of wisdom, you'll get so much out of it. Even if you're like, I'm not a Christian, I don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, it doesn't really matter. So much of his message was counterintuitive, right? If your enemy strikes you on the cheek, turn to him the other. What? So counterintuitive.
Right. Yeah, that's not the ego.
No, that's not the ego. Correct. But the false self can't hear that message. Yeah. It's eye for eye, etc. And so the soul, the true self, is honestly content being poor, monetarily speaking, because it realizes that, well, it craves simplicity. Like I said, and the more money you have, the more problems you have. Mm-hmm. And if you're listening to this and you make a lot of money, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you don't, and you're like, I wonder if that's actually true. Trust me, it is. Yeah. Right. The bigger the business you have, the more problems you have.
Correct.
It never fails, because you have more personalities, you have more expenses, you have a greater need for money because you have to keep up with overhead, yep. Right? There's just more that goes into it. Now, yes, we develop and build a greater degree of resilience within ourselves and a capacity to hold those things. And some people are called to that, truly. And that's awesome. I think it's great, building big businesses that can support the livelihood of other people.
Yeah.
And if that's your purpose, awesome. Just make sure before you go and do that it's not just an unconscious strategy to claim victory over your insecurities.
Yeah. I love that. And I've always loved the ladder analogy. And I think you even shared with me in one of our conversations that a lot of times as we're going up the ladder, we get to the top and we realize that we've got it on the wrong wall.
100%.
And I remember, and this is freaking embarrassing to even admit, but I'm sure there's at least one other person that'll hear this and be like, I can relate to that. As I was doing in phase 1 earlier this year, and you had mentioned this constant pursuit of more,
yep.
which was where I was at. Yep. It was more of everything. And every day I was living this life of 1% improvements. I was going to stay in the cold plunge for 30 seconds longer.
Yep.
And this is ridiculous, but I was always going to run a mile again faster.
Yep.
Every time, no matter what. And this was all physical things, but I got to this point where it was not sustainable.
Sure.
And then as soon as I failed, it all came crashing down.
Yep.
In a very disgusting downward spiral. But as I was going on that journey in that constant pursuit, in phase 1 of 75 Hard, I was having to do 10 minutes of just, not vision work or whatever it's called, but when you're, and not meditation, but one of those things.
Ideation.
And yeah.
Yep.
Just trying to imagine what the life that you want to live looks like.
Yep.
And I was 21 days into this, and that's when I had failed. And then when I started looking back at what that vision work looked like, I was disgusted with what I was focused on. And everything was material.
Yep.
Everything was house, cars, status, business. And then as I went through this journey this summer, that I thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a part of it in some capacity. I had realized I was like, I don't want to be that.
Yeah. Yep.
And even if this for me is chapter 1, I was like, something's got to give.
Yep. And you'll forget that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
You'll forget that, because like I mentioned, it's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Right. We lose it to find it.
Yeah.
We forget it to remember it. Right. We fall off the path and we realize, oh, right, this is an empty game that I'm playing, but I needed to play it a little bit to be reminded of that fact, right? To be reminded of the fact that, you know what, could I work 8 hours a day? Yeah, I could work 8 hours a day. And in many respects, that's encouraged in our society. But does that actually create the life that I desire to live? For many, the answer is yes, simply because they've bought into the notion that that's what life is supposed to look like. And therefore they just kind of blindly, this NPC character, NPC non-player character thing that I was recently kind of turned on to, which I think is super fascinating. Like it's the concept of sheep. It's just another way of saying sheep. But, in the Bible, there's 3 different parables, and all of them have to do with losing and finding. The parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. If we take, for example, the prodigal son, he thought that what I really want, it's out there, right? So what did he do? He asked for his father's inheritance early, and then he goes off and he parties and he squanders his money and he buys all of the things that he thinks are going to make him happy, right? And he loses his inheritance. He spends it, he squanders it. And then what does he do? He goes back home, back to where he first began, where he originally started. And what happened? His father welcomed him with open arms and he threw him a party. What he was really after was there the whole time. He just couldn't see it. Why does that matter? Because so many people are after more, like you talked about, or addicted to becoming a even better version of themselves, thinking that once I get there, once I achieve that, once I realize that version of myself, then I will be happy. And that's just not true.
Right.
It isn't true. Because what you're fundamentally doing is you're constantly kicking the can down the road on your happiness. You're constantly moving the goalposts. So that's the practice that you're in. You will remain in that practice because we always return to what we practice. And so this is why a lot of the guys that I work with, they've checked all the boxes. They're like, all right, I've got the house, I've got the car, I've got the business, the money. Why do I feel empty and unhappy?
Mm-hmm.
What's that about? And so what's their typical answer? They just go back into playing the game more, but more only makes you want more, and the next level only makes you want the next level. It's an empty game. It's a zero-sum game. And so life fundamentally has to become about something bigger than you self-actualizing and becoming a better version of yourself if you're going to truly be happy. And that's where I found myself. My business was the biggest it had ever been. I was making more money than I had ever made in my life. And I was like, I'm not really happy. I thought this was going to make me happy. Had a great business, bought a house, multiple employees. So from outside looking in, it's like, God, I'm doing great. And I felt that way for a while. But then that feeling wore off. Well, what happened then? Well, then I was met with who I really am and what's going on inside of me.
Yeah.
And that's what most people actually don't make time and space for until they're forced to. And that's kind of a reckoning, which is similar to like what you experience, where all of a sudden you experience hardship, trial and tribulation, and who you have become up until that moment, you're forced to reckon with that person.
Yeah.
And for most people, they don't like what they see. They don't like what they see.
Correct.
And I think a great way to describe hell is knowing what you're capable of and failing to realize that.
Yeah.
And that's especially profound, or made to be profound, when you get everything that you thought you wanted and it doesn't do the trick.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to analyze, okay, is this egoic desire, or is this, I've never actually used this phrase before, but it's what's coming to mind, divine desire. Right? Is this like what my soul actually wants, or is this what God wants for me? Whatever language, suits you best, what fine, is this what my soul actually wants? Is this what God wants for me? Or do I want something different?
Yeah.
And for most people, they want something different. I mean, all you have to do is look at a lot of the statistics around people desiring to change jobs. Over 73% of executives are currently thinking about quitting their job. They're not happy.
Right.
They're not doing what they really want to be doing. And if you can get them to sit down and actually have an honest conversation with them, they will tell you that. I promise you.
Yeah.
For most of them, it's like they've been dreaming about doing something for a long time, writing a book, starting a business, right? A different business, traveling, doing whatever. But undoing the life that they have created up until that point has so many drastic implications, because, well, now I have a mortgage. Now I have a car payment. Now I have kids. Now I have a wife, and we're all used to this lifestyle, right? We take 2 vacations a year. So walking that back has some pretty big implications for most people, and they're just unwilling to go through the discomfort that it involves. And so they just keep playing the game, which in my experience is what causes people to have a stroke or a heart attack.
Yeah. Fair enough.
And then they're forced to,
have to do.
Right. And then they're really forced to do it.
Yeah.
it's thrust upon them. And well, if that's what you have to go through, then that's what you have to go through.
Yeah, one of the 3Ds.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and that's where we brought right back to where this conversation started.
Yeah, I love it. Well, a lot of this, at least from my perspective and listening and spending time with you, is a lot of discussion about that transformation into that new life. But it's not just transformation that you do. It also is high performance.
Yeah.
So is a big part of the natural progression then to go from the ego to going through the cave and the darkness and getting led by the mentor to go through, or the guide to go through the transformation and then seek what like real high performance looks like.
Yeah. Well, you will return to where you once started, but you'll know it for the first time, is probably the best way that I would put it. So if you're a highly disciplined person going through this deconstruction process that we're talking about, when it comes to letting go of the ego and surrendering to a higher purpose, a higher power, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
That's going to require that you let some things go, right? Things that used to matter to you, like, waking up at 5 a.m. every day and, going to the gym 6 days a week and being highly disciplined. This is not me saying that you shouldn't be disciplined, by the way.
Right.
It's kind of a paradox in that respect, but you kind of need to let go of your normal way of doing things, right? And that's the whole point of liminal space. You are forced out of your usual order. Right? It falls apart, right? And if you don't let that go, don't worry, it'll be taken from you. And that's why, my favorite author, Richard Rohr, he says, don't worry about engineering your own enlightenment. It'll be done to you.
Yeah.
And so that kind of has to fall apart to a degree, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we want to retain the self-discipline, but it first needs to be redeemed. And what I mean by that is we need to uncover the unconscious intention behind that behavior pattern in order to actually redeem it. Because oftentimes what you find is that what you're really after isn't actually that thing. It's something else. It's acceptance from dad.
Yeah.
Right. For example, it's inclusion with my friends growing up. That's what people are oftentimes after.
Yeah.
Right. So much of men's ambition, it's just a proxy for acceptance. And our ego has convinced us that, like, I'm super ambitious. Oh, okay, you are. But I'm not interested in right, your conscious knowing. I'm interested in the unconscious, because your unconscious is reality. And the reality for most men is that they think they are in pursuit of something, when in reality they're actually running away from something.
Yeah.
Right. It's my insecurities. It's my past. It's my pain. And they don't realize this until they get everything that they want and they feel empty and unfulfilled. Right. They're left wanting.
Yeah.
And that's when they're forced to kind of reconcile some of these things. And so when you think about, okay, well, as a business owner, what does that mean for me? Well, what's the core of any business? It's the business owner. Well, what's the core of the business owner? That's your inner work. Everything rests on the foundation of your inner work. And so the results that you currently have are merely a reflection of your current level of growth and healing, emotional intelligence, and personal development. That's it. And so if we want to create a business that is actually going to be fulfilling in addition to profitable, then we have to work on reconciling the unconscious motivation that serves as the driver for your ambition.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll get everything that you want out of life, out of the business, and you're going to find yourself really unhappy or unable to relax, which leads to unhappiness.
So get everything you think you want.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. But, build your tower, right? But then you're going to be called down from it, or you're going to build your ladder and realize, oh, it's up against the wrong wall.
Yeah.
This is the life I thought I wanted. This is what I thought I should do based on what somebody else told me. Maybe it was mom or dad. Maybe it was a friend. Right. I hear it from a lot of guys these days, like, how did you get into this industry? It's like, oh, somebody told me that I could make money doing this.
Yes.
And it's like, well, did you ever stop and think about what it is that you really wanted before you went and did this? Because the secret is what you want can't be bought.
Right. Well, I think, it's a book that I just finished, but it's called Think Again. And part of the book was a discussion on children.
Sure.
And one of the worst questions that you can ask a child is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And we do this as adults, right?
Yeah.
Because we plant this seed that your identity is what you choose.
Sure.
And so much of our success is built on that. Or to your point, dad said do this or whatever. And then you do. And so many people get to 40 years old and go, what the fuck am I doing?
Totally.
I don't like this.
Yeah.
But now to kind of bring this full circle, and we had this discussion at lunch. And I've been having this discussion in different chapters the entire year. And I'm kind of glad that I'm here now.
Yep.
And you had shared this early on in our first podcast, and it made me laugh because you had said that most coaching work is basically just adding more armor, or we're putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds. We're not fixing the real thing. And as I'm sitting over here listening to this, I'm like, wait a minute, we were doing coaching work. But then as I've gone through some of this process, I'm like, Jake's 100% correct.
Yeah.
And so, as I've segued into the last chapter of this year, and we're getting ready to jump into 2025, a client of ours had positioned to me again. He's like, why don't you guys do another summit again? Cool. And I'm like, no. And he's like, why? I'm like, man, do you guys even like these things? I'm like, how many more rah conferences do we need to have? And he's like, no. He's like, you guys did it different. He was like, there was just a different level of just leadership in class that you brought to it. And he was like, and you guys were never trying to sell us on anything. And I was like, all right, whatever. So one of my professional business coaches at the time was also hugely pushing me to do it. And I kept telling her no. And then so finally I was like, all right, I'll put it out there.
Sure.
And so as we got more and more traction, people saying, yeah, do the thing again. Let's try to do an intimate setting. And I started putting together the lineup. And I don't know if it was my subconscious or whatever it was, but when I got finished with the lineup, it was really interesting because as I looked at it, it was very different than any other one that we had.
Sure.
And I generally pick a keynote speaker who is, and if you're listening to this, you won't see it, but air quotes, crushing it in life, has gone from a 7-figure business to an 8 to a 9 in 3 years. And you're like, oh my God, that's a crazy story.
Yep.
And also that hates their life. But, as I was going through this year, I'm like, no, man, like I really wanted you to be, the one to finish this thing, to speak to some of these things more in depth in front of a bunch of really great people. But everything that we're going to talk about, it starts with some tactical stuff on the front end. Yep. We're going to talk insurance, we're going to talk AI and some of that.
Yep.
We're going to talk a little bit of marketing, believe it or not. And then, but we really transition into the second day to be discussing about being a better leader.
Yep.
And almost every one of the discussions is about being a better leader from within.
Yep.
And as we discussed over lunch, which had nothing to do with the summit, but it's kind of graduated into this. I've really had it on my heart because of you and some other people in my life that have done good things for me.
Sure.
To try to get more exposure for people like you to really help other people live the best version of their life, which for most of us is why we got into business ownership in the first place.
Right. Yeah.
It was for finance. It was for freedom, but we end up not getting those things, or we get the finance, but we don't have the freedom and we don't have the family because we're not spending time with them. And so, I'm just really jazzed to get together a bunch of really great people that I respect. And even though it's just going to be a small drop of the wisdom that you guys have, for you to share some of these things with them. And then big picture, we haven't released anything publicly yet. So this will be the first time that it can be heard, but we're going to relaunch our coaching and consulting program.
So cool.
with partnerships and relationships with you and Miles, and with some others that I think can really give people everything that it is that they're looking for. I mean, I'm really great at systems. I'm really great at giving people a lot of the operational things that they need in business. Miles, who's going to work with us, he's really great at culture building and development of building your bench or a leadership bench inside of an organization. Nick and his team, they're really great at helping people get healthy from the inside out. But I think the one I'm probably the most excited about is you, and helping people not just necessarily do this at a whole different holistic level, but do that inner work, which is the soul. Yeah. And that I think is going to be the thing that is, although it takes a lot of time, that adds the greatest glory at the end.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That I can't remember who said it. I think it might've been Pascal who once said that, all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit in silence in a room alone.
100%.
Right? Because you're forced to be met with the current version of yourself, which oftentimes for most people is not who they aspire to be.
Right. And oftentimes why I think a lot of men smoke and drink and do everything else because they can't sit in there. They need to be numb to it.
Correct. Yeah. And then that's where so much of this work begins, is around being able and willing to feel it all.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the majority of the work that is available to men these days, it's symptom reduction. It's just teaching men how to cope. Right. Yeah. So you get these guys, for example, who are really successful in building a business, but who are wildly out of shape. Okay. Well, now you get them in shape. Right.
Yeah.
But all that did was just rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. Yeah. So from the outside looking in, it looks like transformation has occurred, but it's just external transformation, right? Their identity, how they perceive themselves, their belief system about who they are, and how they fit in with other people in the world, it's still the same. And so they're like, well, why do I feel different? And sometimes, why do I feel worse? And it's like, well, because now you put better results, right? More money, a better body, whatever, on top of this identity, right? And so all it does is amplify that, because money is just an amplifier, right? A better body, it's just an amplifier. So if you have, a broken relationship with yourself, it's only going to amplify that.
Yeah.
And that's the work that the ego avoids, because it wants to keep us in comfort.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to unpack more of that with the folks that come to the summit. I can't wait for next year to spend, a 12-month period of time with a bunch of business owners that are really looking to take their lives first and foremost to the next level.
And that's the great thing, isn't it? The moment you do that, everything else is a side effect to it.
Right.
A better business, a better relationship, a healthier body.
Right.
All of that, by corollary and implication, improves.
Yeah.
But the focus for many is on improving those things, right? Hardware, but the software is still the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they end up reverting back to former levels of behavior.
I know the feeling. Well, man, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I'll be sure to add info to get in touch with you inside of our show notes, as well as how to get tickets to the Mastermind Summit.
Oh, yeah.
The landing page and everything is launched. Tickets are already being sold. So super.
What are the dates?
They are January the 14th and 15th of next year. We have a VIP day, which is a half day.
Nice.
To really take a lot of the stuff that we're talking about and do practical application. So you don't just walk away with a bunch of rah-rah notes. So we actually do something real. But other than that, man, I appreciate you being on.
Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And for everybody listening, thanks so much. Dustin with Life by the Horns and Jake. See you guys.